I know that if I put 0 here, then I'll also get a 0 for my y, and that's an important value because it's going to be this point here where it bends away from the negative numbers, and that's a nice point to find. So on this graph, I want to know where my x is 0, my y is also going to be 0, but then I'll pick some negative values too and some positive values too. And I'm going to make them equal distance on either side of this 0 point. So if I put -4 in for the absolute value, I have the absolute value of -4, and when I take the absolute value of a negative, it turns it to just a positive. And the same thing if I plug in the -2 for my x, that'll become a +2. And if I plug in a +2, it stays a +2. And if I plug in a +4, it'll stay a +4. Now I can graph these. Remember, in the x direction, you go -1, 2, 3, 4, and then +1, 2, 3, 4 in the y direction. So my x direction, my y direction. Now for the next coordinate, -2, 2, start at 0, -1, -2, and then +1, 2. And then 0, 0, and then 2, 2, 1, 2 in the x direction, +2 again in the y direction, and then 4, 4. So +1, 2, 3, 4 in the x direction, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the y direction. Now that's enough for me to see my V shape. So I'll go ahead and mark that in. And anytime I have an absolute value, I should expect it to come out looking like a V. Now when I do the domain, we forgot to do that on the last problem, but we'll do it here. The domain, we're talking about values for x, and I can look at these values and see that I'm going, any numbers I could have chosen all the way across from -infinity to +infinity, and I can also see it on the graph. If I'm over here at -infinity, eventually I'll be able to get up there to a point on my graph. And then for the range, which is in the y direction, I can see that I only have positive numbers here, and it goes from 0, and it'll keep on going up and up, as I can also see from my graph. I have nothing down here from -infinity up to 0. Once I get to 0, I start having values, and up here there's a value over here and here. It'll keep going. As far up as I go, there will still be a value on my graph if I move over far enough. So it goes from 0 to +infinity, and 0 is included, so it needs a square bracket. Alright, let's look at this problem. You can take a minute. And I want to do my XY table. And I'm still thinking, what is going to give me the 0? If I put a 0 in here for x, that'll give me a 0 when I take the absolute value plus 3. And that's probably going to be the smallest point that I have. So we'll just put the 0 for x and a +3 for the y. And then let's check a couple points on either side of that. So if I put in -2, this absolute value is just on the -2, so it will flip positive, so then I'll have 2 plus 3, or a 5. And then if I do the y equals -4, for the -4 for the x, when I take the absolute value of -4, I get 4 plus 3, so that's going to give me a +7. When I put in a 2 for the x, I get a +2 from the absolute value plus 3. I'll get a 5 here, and then I'm also going to get a 7 here for that 4. Let's mark it on the graph. I have 0, I'll start on that one, 0, 1, 2, 3, that's 1 point on my graph. And I have a -2, 5, -2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a -4, and this was 5, 6, 7. And then in the positive direction at 2, I have to go up to 5 also, and at 4 I have to go up to 7 also. So this graph is shifted up from the x-axis 3 units. And when I graph it, it still has that characteristic V shape. It's just not touching the x-axis, and that's perfectly reasonable. Now, my domain, remember I could use any values. Any values across here will have a corresponding point on the graph. So it's negative infinity to positive infinity. And for my y, look at my values. And then come to the graph and look from negative infinity, nothing, 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 until I get to a positive 3, all the way up to positive infinity, and that 3 is part of my graph. So there's my domain. It goes from 3 on up for the range. Let's take a look at some quadratic functions now. These are a little different. You don't see any absolute values, but you do see exponents. So let's take a look at how those are going to come out. In my x direction, I can choose what values I want, but I know they're going to get big pretty fast because I'm squaring whatever I put in there. So I'm going to stick with some pretty small numbers. Negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2. Okay, so if I put in a negative 2, I have y equals, use your parentheses, negative 2 quantity squared minus 4. When I square negative 2, I get 4. So that's going to give me a 0. If I put in a negative 1, I have negative 1 quantity squared, which is 1, minus 4, which is going to give me a negative 3. When I put in 0, that'll be 0 minus 4, or negative 4. And if I put in a 1, it'll be 1 minus 4, or negative 3. And a 2. 2 squared will be 4, minus 4, that's going to give me a 0. Also, I want to try 2 more values because I don't think we're going to see enough of the shape, so I'll do a negative 3 and a positive 3. If I put a negative 3 in, see if I can squeeze it in up here, negative 3 quantity squared minus 4, that'll give me 9 minus 4, which is going to give me a 5. And if I do a positive 3 squared only, minus 4, then I have 9 minus 4 again, which is going to give me a 5. Now, I need to be very careful when I use the negatives here because the whole thing that I stick in for x has to be squared. So the negative 3 times negative 3 gives me a positive 9. If I don't do that correctly, I'm not going to come up with the right points to plug in here and here. Okay, let's graph. So I have negative 2, 0. Negative 2 comes first in the x direction, 0 in the y direction. Then I have negative 1, negative 3. So negative 1, 2, 3. And then I have 0, negative 4. 1, negative 3. 2, 0. And now I have my negative 3 and positive 5. And positive 3, positive 5 also. Now this almost looks like a V, but take a look. When we put the ruler there, if I was going to go from my first point to my second point, it would have to go way out here, and I'm missing these other points. And the same thing, if I took these 2 points together, it would miss this point here also. And if I took these 2 points together, I'm not coming out anywhere near my intersection on this y-axis. So what I need to do instead is form a sort of rounded shape that's going up very, very quickly. This is a parabola, and it has a kind of a U shape. Alright, you can't use the ruler to make it, but it should be pretty rounded going up. Alright, my domain, which is in the x direction, anywhere, if I pick a value way out here, I will be able to square it and subtract 4. So I will have a point. It'll